Careers of Danger and Daring by Cleveland Moffett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Careers of Danger and Daring by Cleveland Moffett. Part 4. The Story of a Boy Who Ran Away in a Big Balloon. One of the professor's hobbies is that gas air balloons are better and safer than the hot air kind, although the latter cost less to operate. Your hot air balloon goes up in a rush, but comes down again as soon as it cools, and in the coming down lies the danger. A gas balloon, on the other hand, stays up as long as you keep gas in it, and the professor's secret of varnishing holds gas like a trap. As to the ordinary use of hot air balloons for parachute dropping, the professor only has condemnation. A parachute, says he, is a sin and a disgrace, a thing to be prohibited by law. The parachute kills more people every year, the professor is still talking, than many a battle, and kills them in unpleasant ways. Drops them on live electrical wires, which shock them to death. Drops them in lakes, where they're drowned, or in the ocean, where they can be eaten by sharks. Drops them in trees where they can catch their coat collars and choke to death, drops them on sharp railings which spear them through, drops them, but the professor's list, backed by statistics be it said, is too long and gruesome. It's only fair to add that I have a friend, Leo Stevens, a professional aeronaut who has made thousands of drops from hot air balloons and claims that nothing is safer than a parachute and says he can steer one in its downward sailing so as to avoid dangerous landing places. Although he does admit numerous hairbreadth escapes, as when he dropped from a parachute 2 miles out at sea, this at Long Branch in 1898, and was only saved by his life preserver and the courage of some fishermen, or, again, when Dive, his partner in ballooning ventures, dropped with him, on one occasion, from a big balloon. One parachute was suspended on the either side, and landed in Lake Canandaigua, and was drowned. "Oh, there's no doubt a man takes a chance on a parachute," says Stevens, "but I like it." There's a singular thing about parachutes, Stevens contends, not sufficiently considered by Professor Myers in his experiments. The professor, with his usual thoroughness, has tested all shapes and kinds of parachutes by dropping them from a captive balloon with a sandbag hitched on instead of a man. The dropping was done by a fuse which would burn the supporting rope and at a given moment set the parachute free, just as a man under the parachute would cut it free. And in a large number of cases the parachute did not open in time to save the sandbag man from destruction on the ground. "This proves," argues the professor, "that parachutes are extremely dangerous." "Nothing of the sort," answers Leo Stevens. "It only proves that there's a big difference between sandbag man and real man. The sandbag man is dead weight, and the real man is live weight. A parachute will open for the one where it won't open for the other." "Why will it," queries the professor, "if a man and the sandbag weigh the same?" "I don't know why, but it will," Stevens insists, "and if what you say were true, I'd be dead long ago, and my wife, and all my assistants." I remember well my first visit to the aeronaut Stevens at his little balloon establishment on 3rd Avenue, a rambling, gas-as-you-please attic, with things strewn about anyhow, lengths of balloon cloth hanging from rafters for varnish to dry, crinkly yellow segments of balloons heaped near a sewing machine that was stretching them into spheres, rows of hot air balloons from past seasons ranged along the shelves in tight bundles, models of flying machines, all kinds of parachutes, including one in red, white, and blue, made to take up a dog, and in various dusty corners photographs of Leo Stevens walking a tightrope, Leo Stevens rising to the clouds over waving multitudes, Leo Stevens and his big umbrella soaring down to earth from the heights of 20 steeples, swinging with dancing master grace from the bar of his trapeze. I liked this place for the good-natured faces of Kid Benjamin, who was scooping cold salmon out of a tin when I came in, and a young lady with long eyelashes who was running the machine. "Leo Stevens was out," said this young lady. "He was seeing some patent lawyers about his new airship, but she was Mrs. Stevens, and could she do anything for me? She made dozens of balloons and parachutes, yes, and used them too." It was Kid Benjamin who offered this latter information, remarking that she was grand on a parachute. Mrs. Stevens smiled and explained that she had never made an ascension in her life until the previous summer, then only because her husband was in a fix through the failure of another woman to appear. A balloon race had been advertised between two lady aeronauts, and when the time came, one of them, Mrs. Nina Madison, was missing. Rather than have the thing a failure and the big crowd disappointed, Mrs. Stevens agreed to go up. She would take Miss Nina's place and race the professional. And she did it and won the race. "You see," she said, "I don't feel nervous as another woman might, because I'd been living with balloons for years. Besides, they hitched me fast to the parachute ropes, so I couldn't have fallen if I'd wanted to. It was lovely going up. Everyone said we made a beautiful ascension, and two balloons kept so close together that the other lady and I were talking all the way. At last, when we were up about 3,000 feet, she called out that my balloon was settling and for me to cut. But I called back, 'Cut yourself!' And sure enough, she did in a minute, and I watched her parachute open and sink and get smaller and smaller until she reached the ground. A few minutes later, when I saw my balloon had really settled, I cut too. Oh, what a sensation! You know those awful dreams where you fall and fall? Well, it's just like that for 2 or 3 seconds until your parachute fills wide and springs you up against the ropes. Then you sail down, down, with a lovely easy motion until you get to the ground. But look out for the landing. Once I struck a treetop, and you're liable to come down on a house or anything." "You're liable to come down in the middle of a lake," put in Kid Benjamin. "Do you go up?" said I to the kid, whose hands and face showed black smears from painting balloon cloth. He was certainly not over 18. "Do I?" he answered with a grin. "I made more than 20 ascensions and drops last summer." "He's the one," Mrs. Stevens said, "who carried that boy up hanging from the parachute ropes. Don't you remember? At Coney Island? The boy was helping to hold the balloon, and when she started, his foot got caught, and he went up hanging by his foot." The kid nodded. "Yep, stuck fast in the rigging by one shoe. As I sat on the trapeze bar, there was that boy 40 feet above me, kicking and yelling. Say, you'd never guess what he was yelling about." "I suppose he was afraid." The kid shook his head. "No, sir. He didn't seem to mind the 800 feet we'd gone up, not a bit. What worried him was the 60 cents in pennies and nickels that had spilled out of his pants pocket while he was upside down." Then the kid explained how he postponed his parachute drop on this occasion and got down safely, boy and all, by letting the balloon cool off and gradually settle to the ground. "Isn't a parachute pretty long when it hangs down?" I asked. "Certainly. It's 35 feet from where she hitches on the balloon to where you sit on the bar. That's lengths of rope and lengths of cloth, both." "Then how do you cut her loose from way down on the bar?" "I'll tell you," put in Mrs. Stevens. "You just pull a tape that hangs down inside the parachute from a cutaway block at the parachute head. The holding rope passes through the block, and there's a knife blade in the block over the rope. The tape pulls the knife blade down, and away you go. It's one of my husband's inventions." She was plainly very proud of her husband. Presently entered Leo Stevens himself, a surprisingly young man for such a veteran, scarcely over 30, the explanation being that he began ballooning as a mere child. Before he was 10, he had gained some mastery of slack-wire feats, and at 13 he was known over the country as Prince Leo, a marvel of the air, in black and gold, making the fortune of some gentlemen who exploited him. His arrival recalled the object of my visit, which was to get from him some practical ideas for balloon and parachute experiments on a small scale, the kind of thing a boy might undertake in their own backyard, and, on learning this, Stevens caught my idea at once. He knew just what I wanted, and was glad to help. He liked boys himself, and we settled down forthwith to a consideration of segments and materials and dimensions, and after a little planning and measuring, he had the problem solved. "A hot air balloon is the easiest and cheapest for boys to make," said Stevens, "and it goes up with more of a rush than a gas balloon. So we'll tell them how to make a hot air balloon. I remember a boys' balloon picnic that I got up one summer at Chautauqua Lake while I was making ascensions there. What fun those boys did have! We sent up a kitten in a strawberry basket, strapped fast, you know, so she couldn't fall out, and the balloon hung from the parachute by a time fuse that burned loose about 1,000 feet up, and down came the whole thing, parachute, kitten, and all, sailing beautifully and landing as easily as you please. It never hurt the kitten at all, but the balloon drifted nearly a mile away across the swamp and stuck in a big tree. What a time those boys had chasing it and climbing after it and slopping home with it after dark through the swamp with lanterns and torches. I suppose they got well spanked, a good many of them, but boys don't mind." "How big was this balloon?" "About 11 feet inflated, That's a good size. I mean 11 feet high inflated, but the segments must be cut at 18 feet long to allow for the curve. See?" And he made a sketch of a single segment. "There must be 14 segments like this, each one 18 feet long, 2 feet wide at the widest part, then tapering to a point at one end, the top, and to a width of 5 inches at the other end, the mouth, which must be left open. These segments are made from ordinary sheets of tissue paper, first pasted into long sheets using ordinary starch paste, and then cut out after the pattern. Then the 14 segments must be pasted together lengthwise along the edges, and they'll form a balloon with enough lifting power to take a parachute and a small passenger, say a kitten or a puppy." "We must tell them how to fill this balloon with hot air," I suggested. "That's so," said Stevens, "but it's very simple. They must dig a trench in the yard or somewhere 5 feet long and 1 foot deep, with a hole dug at one end for a fire. Then they must cover enough of the trench with pieces of tin and spread dirt over that and boards over all. This is for a good draft. Then they must make a fire in the hole at one end of the trench out of barrel staves or anything that'll give hot flame, and towards the last they might throw a little kerosene. That's exactly the way we make our fires for big ascensions. At the other end of the trench they must fix a stovepipe sticking straight out of the draft hole into the mouth of the balloon, and 4 or 5 boys must stand around on fences and boxes to hold the sides of the balloon away from the fire, which will be shooting high above the chimney. Many a big hot air balloon has been burned up that way on a windy day, and in our ascensions we have dozens of ropes sewn all over the balloon sides. We call them wind guys, so that men can pull the cloth away from the fire while it's filling. Say, talking about boys getting spanked, I must tell you a story." The story came from his own boyish experiences, how he made his first trip into the clouds at the age of 12 and set a whole city talking. This was the city of Cleveland, Ohio, where on certain Sunday afternoons there was to be a balloon ascension at a great pleasure park. Young Stevens, of course, was present, wild with excitement, for balloons had been in his thoughts and dreams ever since he could remember. He pressed forward through the crowd and with bulging eyes watched the aeronaut arrange his barrels and pipes for the hydrogen making, danced with delight as the big bag swelled and struggled, and finally was bitter in disappointment when the police appeared suddenly with orders to prevent the ascension because the day was Sunday. Then, while the balloonist was protesting and pleading, Stevens formed a plan. He would go up himself instead of the man. There was a balloon all ready, held by a single rope. There was the basket, swinging impatiently, empty, and he more impatient than the basket. Quickly he turned to a boy who was with him. "Say, I'll tell you what, you get a knife and cut that rope, and I'll go up." But the boy demurred. Anyhow, he had no knife, so away dashed Stevens, and returned in a jiffy with a knife taken from his father's shop. It was a sharp one. "There," panted the boy. "Now cut her quick, soon as I climb in." The people about were so occupied with the parley growing warm between the balloonist and the police that few paid attention when a little shaver in knickerbockers crept close to the basket, then slipped over its side. But the next minute 9,000 people paid considerable attention and shouted their surprise and delight as the eager balloon suddenly shot skyward, a small white face peering down and trying not to look frightened. The knife had done its work, and the subject of the dispute, abruptly removed, was presently soaring half a mile above the city, drifting with the wind. Meanwhile, little Leo curled up in the bottom of the car and was saying over to himself a story he had read of 2 little babies who went up once in a balloon and sailed far, far away and never came back. But they might have come back if only they had been strong enough to pull a string that hung over them. Hello? So there was a string to pull. Well, any boy could pull a string. He wasn't a baby. But where was the old string? He must look about and find it. And sure enough, he did find it, only it turned out to be a stout rope. And he tugged at it valiantly until the valve opened and the balloon began to descend, just as the storybook said it would. And so occupied was Leo with keeping his valve open that he never once looked into the wide view spread beneath him, nor knew where he was until he came bumping into a treetop and found himself upset amongst the branches, which first tore his clothes to tatters, then dropped him into a muddy canal, whence he emerged a sadly battered and bedraggled aeronaut, yet happy. Even when his mother chastised him that evening with a ramrod, his father being a gunmaker, he remained serene. For had he not gone up in a balloon? And was not the whole of Cleveland admiring him? And would he not go up again? He knew he would, despite all promises made under ramrod stress, as soon as chances presented. And within a year the chance did present. a bait of $50 per ascension being offered the lad, and the outcome was he ran away from home and saw no more of his family until years had passed, and he had grown accustomed to the dangers of the air and the diamonds of value in his apparel. "Isn't it queer," said Stevens, talking it over, "how a fellow will stay away from his people when everything is all right and get back to them through trouble? After I started in to be a balloonist, I never saw my mother for 7 years. Then I came once more to Cleveland to give an exhibition at the very park where I first went up. They call it Forest City Park. I was to perform on a slack wire 900 feet long, stretched between two towers 150 feet high. My wire wasn't long enough to reach all the way, so they spliced on a length of 300 feet more, and before I began my feat, I walked back and forth over the wire to test it. I always do that. Then I walked to the middle of the wire and pretended to slip and fall. That's a regular trick to startle the crowd. You let yourself drop suddenly, catch on the wire, and spring up again. Well, this time when I let myself drop, I didn't spring up again, and I didn't know anything more for 19 days when I came to myself in the Huron Street Hospital. Somehow the splice in the wire had broken, and I went straight to the ground, breaking one arm, both wrists, and cracking my spinal column in 4 places. It's a wonder I lived at all, they say, and during that hard time my mother came to me, as mothers do. Oh, she doesn't love the balloon business, I can tell you, but I love it. I've made over 1,000 ascensions and never been badly hurt but once." We were far away now from our balloon making, and I reminded Stevens that we were still to tell the boys how to make a parachute. "All right," he said, "here you are," and he gave me the following directions. "The parachute is made of 14 segments of tissue paper, each one like this, measuring 36 inches long, 6 inches wide at the base, and tapering like a pattern up to a point. These segments must be pasted together lengthwise, the 14 points joining at the top of the parachute, and in each one of the 14 side seams a length of 80 inches of number 8 thread must be pasted, leaving 2 inches sticking out at the top and about 4 feet hanging down below. The short ends at the top must be tied together, and these made fast to a piece of iron hoop pasted in the mouth of the balloon. Here the fuse must be placed and lighted just as the balloon is ready to start. A 5-minute fuse will be long enough, and it must be so placed that when it has burned its time, the parachute will fall from the balloon. The long ends below must be tied to a curtain ring from which the little basket hangs, with the kitten securely fastened in it by a piece of cloth pierced with 4 holes for the 4 legs. This can be brought up over the kitten's back and tied to the sides of the basket. In this way, the kitten is in neither danger nor discomfort. The boys must be careful to make this plain to mothers and sisters, or their experiments may be stopped by family orders. I'll guarantee one thing, though, if they carry out these instructions carefully, your boys will have a fine time." "I certainly hope they will." End of Part 4, Careers of Dangers and Daring by Cleveland Moffett. Read by Jerry Beckert.